Yeah, usually there's some stragglers coming from other classes. A little late, but I think we'll just begin. Thank you for coming, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Colin Simmons. Our talk today is titled "The Trouble of Rocks and Waters" on the impossibility of Buddhist environmental ethics. Generally speaking, there's a lot of kind of popular discourse around the ecological potentials of Buddhism in its kind of modern forms, although many scholars have started to push back against this popular formulation. And so I'm going to take up the question in this lecture of whether a Buddhist environmental ethics is possible. To do so, we'll first go over just a brief introduction to what eco-Buddhism is. We'll look at some of the critiques of historical Buddhist views of nature. We'll look at the arguments for the impossibility of Buddhist environmental ethics. And then we'll look at the arguments for the possibility of Buddhist environmental ethics. And finally, we'll look at how one might implement this Buddhist environmental ethic. So, of the many modern assumptions made about Buddhism, one of the most persistent is that it's an eco-friendly religion. Whether because of its apparent emphasis on nonviolence, the nature imagery of Siddhartha Gautama's enlightenment experience, or the centrality of pratitut samutpada, or interdependence in Mahayana traditions, the Buddhist tradition has consistently been lauded as a positive ecological force in the contemporary religious landscape. However, as recent studies have shown, this view of Buddhism as an eco-friendly tradition has historically been quite far from its material reality. Despite this clear disparity, there's still a case to be made about the ethical potential of Buddhism in environmental contexts. Even if historical Buddhists have not acted in ways that promoted the flourishing of the non-human world, its philosophy and its practice may be of benefit to us in our present situation of ecological catastrophe. It's therefore imperative that scholars begin paying serious attention to the potential ways that the Buddhist ethical tradition can be mobilized towards environmental ethical ends. That said, there is perhaps a significant limitation to constructing a Buddhist environmental ethic, which is rocks, waters, and other non-sentient phenomena in the ecosystem. Whether treated individually or as a collective ecological community, there's a clear bias towards sentient beings in Buddhist contexts that may restrict its ability to adequately respond to climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and so forth. The necessary inclusion of rocks and waters in an environmental ethic therefore greatly troubles the construction of an authentic Buddhist environmental ethic. So this talk will explore this particular limitation and assess the possibility of a genuinely Buddhist environmental ethic. It will begin by reviewing prominent criticisms of the Buddhist environmental ethical project by scholars of Buddhism to identify the major obstacles a Buddhist environmental ethic must overcome. It will then explore the tensions between mainstream environmental ethics and Buddhist philosophy by questioning if Buddhism can meet the bar for what qualifies environmental ethics in these contemporary contexts. In turn, it will critique some of the philosophical assumptions of these Western environmental ethics from a Buddhist position. And finally, this talk will propose a way to alleviate this tension by articulating a Buddhist environmental ethic on its own philosophical terms. And in doing so, it will show how the Buddhist philosophical tradition that first developed in India and preserved in Tibet indeed has the requisite components for constructing an effective environmental ethic and can therefore be a beneficial voice in the global movement towards addressing climate change. So before we get into some of these critiques, students in my class will be familiar with these works and some of these arguments, but for those who aren't in the class, there are two major collections of Buddhist eco-apologetics. These two collections involve scholars and practitioners making the claim that Buddhism is inherently a green religion for one reason or another. Typically, these arguments take place on kind of two different axes, a historical or material base, or like argument, or a philosophical base for eco-Buddhism. So of these first, there's this idea or this picture of monastic renunciation as anti-consumerist, this like idyllic monk or nun living in the forest, not consuming much. Nature has a really important place in the Buddha's enlightenment story. The Buddha was enlightened under a Bodhi tree. All these serpent beings helped him along the way, protected him from rain and so forth. When he became enlightened, the earth goddess kind of roared in kind of admiration and recognition. So nature exists as this agent in the Buddha's life story. There's also this positive valuation of wild spaces in the Buddhist tradition as ideal places for retreat. So like in wild nature, that's where one would go to actually achieve like spiritual progress. More popularly though, there's philosophical arguments for why Buddhism is inherently a green religion. The first of these is its notion of dukkha, which translates to stress, suffering, unease, dissatisfaction, and so forth, can be applied to kind of ecological contexts. And we can look at the environment as this cause of dukkha, and therefore we need to work within that. Second, popularly, Buddhism is portrayed as this non-violent religion. This notion of ahimsa is really prevalent in it, and this could be applicable to ecological phenomena. Probably most prominently is its notion of pratitut samutpada, or interdependence, dependent origination, interconnection. This gets kind of equated with contemporary notions of ecology, and so it gets kind of lauded as naturally green. And finally, different Buddhist virtues like karuna, which is compassion or care or loving kindness, get directed towards environmental ends or are regarded as themselves inherently environmental. And so these are some of the positions that eco-critics, these critical scholars of the ecological Buddhist project, kind of take up and kind of analyze and poke holes in. So there's been a significant number of scholars in the past several decades that have criticized and questioned the compatibility of Buddhist thought in environmental ethics. The earliest of these critiques arose in the 1990s in the work of Ian Harris and Lambert Schmidthausen and centered around the doctrinal goals of early Buddhist practice. Rather than become one with the natural world, as some eco-Buddhists encourage, these scholars note how early Buddhist practice was aimed at overcoming and transcending the material world and all of its natural elements. As Lambert Schmidthausen states, I, for one, find it hard to deny that the overwhelming majority of the canonical materials suggest that in early Buddhism, it was just a matter of course to strive in the first place for one's own self-perfection and release. Despite this historical rejection of natural phenomena, Schmidthausen nonetheless holds open the possibility that Buddhism may be able to authentically respond to the environmental problems of today. In contrast, the Japanese scholar Noriaki Hakiyama holds no such optimism. As both Schmidthausen and Ian Harris have commented, Hakiyama wrote an extremely critical response to Schmidthausen's early work on the possibility of an authentic Buddhist response to environmental issues, titled Buddhism as a Criticism of Physia Natura. He writes that Buddhism explicitly negates nature and seems, quote, to advocate uncompromisingly and with emotional commitment a negative attitude towards nature, based on the otherworldliness of canonical Buddhism. So any attempt to craft a positive attitude towards the environment out of Buddhist source material is, according to these scholars, necessarily a modern innovation. Harris does concede that it is unhelpful to characterize eco-Buddhism as a deviation from traditional norms, and that it would be far closer to the truth to see eco-Buddhism as an example of a vigorous tradition engaged in a healthy process of reflexive apologetics. But elsewhere, he makes clear that, quote, Buddhism's ultimate aim is to escape from the restrictions imposed by our positions as beings within the world, and that concern for the animal kingdom can happily be taken as baggage on the path to perfection, but at some stage it will be left at the side of the road. Thus, far from holding a positive view of the natural world, canonical Buddhism is not in essence an ecological religion, and can at best be seen as ambivalent towards the natural world, and at worst seen as completely negative in its comportment to the human world. So these textual or philological critiques of these scholars is further strengthened by recent historical works on the material relationships between humans and non-humans in Buddhist settings. For example, Johan Elverskog's The Buddhist Footprint in 2020 shows how canonical Buddhist positions on the relationship between wealth and merit spurred a proto-capitalist market economy that compelled a willingness, quote, to exploit not only the natural world for monetary gain, but also the people who lived in proximity to its resources. Similarly, Elverskog shows how the Buddhist preference for the beauty of the human manipulation of nature over the beauty of wild nature result in massive agricultural developments across Buddhist Asia. He writes that the cultivation of and trade of rice, sugar, and cotton and tea had earth-shattering environmental consequences, and demonstrates how, as a result of the increase of monasteries and city centers, the environmental impact of Buddhist urbanization was immense. And even in cases where Buddhist principles likely should have encouraged positive action towards the more than human world, the material history of Buddhist cultures maintained this exploitative relationship. As Jeffrey Barstow shows in his 2018 book, Food of Sinful Demons, both cultural and economic pressures superseded the religious impulse towards vegetarianism in Tibet, where meat was not only seen as a necessary evil, but as a positive good by both the laity and the monastics alike. So both principles found in canonical Buddhism, as well as the material history of human-non-human relationships in Buddhist societies, push back against this popular narrative of Buddhism as an eco-friendly religion. So these major critiques are primarily directed towards Buddhist pasts. However, the third major critique of eco-Buddhism found in contemporary scholarship is directed towards the potential of Buddhism to construct an environmental ethic. More specifically, scholars like Ian Harris and Daniel Kapper have brought into question the relevance of the Buddhist notion of pratitut samutpada, so this term that means dependent origination or interdependence or interconnection, as a foundation on which to build an authentically Buddhist environmental ethic. And their critiques take place on two major axes. One, the false equivalency of pratitut samutpada in nature or the environment, and two, the ethical flattening of this ontological position. So regarding the first of these, Harris has shown how there was historically no word for nature, as it's kind of understood today in green discourse in Buddhist languages, and that pratitut samutpada simply lacks the semantic range capable of capturing the term nature or environment. As Harris writes, quote, modern environmentalist thinking makes much of the interdependence of things in the natural world. And it's certainly true that the doctrine of interconnection is in tune with the worldview which accepts complex interdependent relationships. However, there's a problem associated with making a comparison between Buddhism and environmental thinking, which the scholars mentioned above fail to acknowledge. The Buddhist analysis of things, be they animate or inanimate, is far more radical than that adopted by Western ecology. Thus, according to Harris, the common eco-Buddhist impulse to draw from pratitut samutpada for environmentalist inspiration is both philologically, so like textually, and linguistically inappropriate. But Harris's critique goes above this mere semantic difference. Elsewhere, he expands this critique to claim that pratitut samutpada is also an inappropriate philosophical basis for eco-Buddhism. He puts this critique quite bluntly when he writes, Buddhist environmentalism aims to open up the possibility of a better ordering of man's relations with the natural world in its infinite diversity and complexity. Yet its adherence to the Huayan principle of interdependence negates its social and eco-activist agenda. For, and this is kind of the key part, if all depends on all, as kind of interconnection posits, then the black rhino depends on the hydrogen bomb and the rainforest on the waste dump. And he's not alone in this skeptical attitude towards the ecological potential of interconnection. Daniel Kapper in his book last year echoes this statement when he writes, if we must value everything because everything is interconnected, then we must protect ocean radioactivity as well as dolphins, atmospheric carbon as well as parrots, and anthrax as well as human probiotics. What Harris and Kapper are alleging is that pratitut samutpada, or interdependence, creates this flattened ontology incapable of supporting any kind of discriminating ethic or the ability to choose between two ethical options. This ineptitude of interdependence actually goes further than mere semantic incompatibility, but may compel an indifference to the plight of the more than human world. So musing again on the rhino, Ian Harris writes, for the environmentalist, the potential demise of these noble creatures is a matter of sadness and concern. To counteract this possibility, measures will be taken to protect the species by mitigating the destructive forces at work in the rhino's habitat. In this sense, environmentalism represents a fight against pollution and resource depletion. A Buddhist, however, is unlikely to view things this way. Change, dissolution, suffering, and death are the hallmarks of all conditioned things. At the deepest level, what we take to be a rhino is nothing more than a complex series of momentary dharmas, or like atoms, which have come together in a certain pattern. And the rise and fall of all things, whether they be mountains or animals, is a part of the inexorable process Buddhists call samsara, this wheel of rebirth and reincarnation. So in other words, rather than inspire environmental action, reflecting on the extinction of the rhino may compel us to simply pursue Buddhist practice in order to escape rebirth altogether and go to nirvana. So even in contemporary constructions of eco-Buddhism that recognize the novelty of their position, both Ian Harris and Daniel Kapper argue that pratitut samutpada does not provide a sufficient ground for environmental thought and practice. So things kind of seem impossible. To borrow some terminology from Donald Swearer's classification of Buddhist eco-philosophy, the above eco-critics direct the remarks primarily to those engaged in eco-apologetics and eco-constructivism. For the most part, these are fair critiques and are worth considering. However, rarely do we find eco-critics respond to those engaged in Buddhist eco-ethics. Scholars working in the ecoethics modality begin from meta-ethical theories of the nature of Buddhist ethics and apply these ethical principles to the more than human world. For example, Padmasiri de Silva, Damien Keown, Simon P. James, and David P. Cooper have all argued for an eco-Buddhism on the grounds of either rule-based or character-based ethical formulations. However, the degree to which these articulations actually constitute an authentic Buddhist environmental ethic is somewhat questionable. And this is because of how natural phenomena like rocks and waters are either interpreted outside of traditional Buddhist hermeneutical categories, or they're instrumentalized in an overemphasis on biotic life and biotic communities. The one scholar who's made a serious attempt to push back against these eco-ethical positions is Daniel Capper. In Roaming Free Like a Deer, he first establishes a goalpost for what constitutes an environmental ethic, and then evaluates the potential for historical and contemporary Buddhisms to fulfill this given criteria. To determine what constitutes a satisfactory environmental ethic, Capper turns to two major philosophers in the field, Holmes Rolston III and Arnie Nace. He therefore engages two approaches to environmental ethics in the land ethic and deep ecology, respectively. And while the particulars of these theories and their ethical prescriptions are quite distinct from one another, Capper nonetheless sees them as important touchstones for contemporary environmental ethics and uses them to highlight two major aspects of contemporary environmental thought. So, according to Capper, the most important aspect of an environmental ethic is the preservation of a sustainable biosphere. To define environmental ethics, he writes, the full biosphere must be ecocentrically sustainable in terms of meeting the needs of both humans and non-humans today, while not sacrificing ecological needs of tomorrow. To substantiate this definition, he turns to Rolston's articulation of the land ethic, whom he quotes as stating that a sustainable biosphere is the baseline quality of environment founded on the ecocentric notion of land as community, and that this community necessarily includes air, water, soil, forests, rural lands, wildlife, renewable resources, and so forth. Capper also quotes Rolston to assert that the bottom line, transcultural and non-negotiable, is a sustainable biosphere of the full Earth, since our integrity is inseparable from Earth integrity. So Capper posits, by way of Rolston, a holistic, land-based environmental ethic focused foremost at the integrity of the whole ecosystem rather than the individual beings within it. And when this is used as a means for assessing Buddhist approaches to the more than human world, Capper concludes that the tradition falls short of promoting such an ethic. He writes that the Buddhist tradition has strong elements which support a concern for animal welfare, but that it's limited in terms of realizing Rolston's sustainable biosphere. Rolston himself makes a major distinction between these two outcomes in his book, A New Environmental Ethics. Reflecting on Mark Sagoff's claim that environmentalists cannot be animal liberationists and animal liberationists cannot be environmentalists, Rolston writes, environmental ethics will object that in an ethic based on sentience and stopping there, most of the biological world has yet to be taken into account. And animal-based ethics can value everything only instrumentally with reference to higher animals, who form only a small fraction of living things, and this is too short-sighted. An animal rights or welfare ethic, if it stops there, is blind to the still larger effort in environmental ethics to value life at all its ranges and levels, indeed to care for a biosphere Earth. And so pictured here, the Animal Liberation Front would be like one of these groups or traditions that falls short. It's like maybe one of my favorite pictures. It's like incredibly sinister looking, but these beagles were being tested upon and these like sinister looking people just rescued them and kind of found them nice homes. So bit of an aside. But this holistic articulation of the land ethic that Rolston's talking about and a sustainable biosphere as the quintessence of environmental ethics does present a major challenge for Buddhist ethical approaches to the more than human world, which traditionally will rely upon sentience and the sentience of individual beings as the single qualifier for moral consideration. Furthermore, Capper's critique of environmental ethics extends beyond this emphasis on holism, as he highlights the trouble that an ethical valuation of individual rocks and waters poses to the Buddhist ethical formulations. He writes, for most Buddhists, notions of reincarnation result in the targeting of compassion toward animals, but not toward plant, minerals, or waters, resulting in a limited biocentric orientation. And this limited biocentric attitude substantially lacks the ecocentric elements required by a full environmental ethic, which must recognize that plant, mineral, and water resources too need to be valued in order to create ecosystem health. So not only do these abiotic elements need to be valued in Capper's articulation of environmental ethics, but they need to be valued intrinsically. Following the above passage, he alludes to Arne Naess and his philosophy of deep ecology as a source of this understanding of valuing abiotic elements, which ascribes this intrinsic valuation to biotic and abiotic individuals in the more than human world. Capper also makes this point explicit when he writes that with intention and for their own sake, Rolston extends ethical value to abiotic elements of the environment, such as gases, water bodies, and stones, as a part of enhancing total ecosystem health. Kind of interestingly, this deviates slightly from Rolston's presentation of intrinsic value. Rolston ascribes intrinsic value to life, but not abiotic phenomena like rocks and waters. He does, however, push back on the statement that we do not have duties to rocks, air, ocean, dirt, or earth. We have duties to people or sentient beings, but he does so through an appeal to the instrumental value of rocks and waters to the flourishing of a sustainable biosphere. Nonetheless, we can understand how the intrinsic valuation of rocks and waters in certain environmental ethical formulations like deep ecology can be quite a difficult bar for Buddhist ethics to meet. And how even the intrinsic valuation of plant life might be a major challenge for traditional Buddhist ethics, which centers sentience as the primary qualifying moral characteristic. So both the holistic approach to environmental ethics found in the land ethic and the intrinsic valuation of abiotic phenomena in articulations like deep ecology make it quite difficult to construct a truly environmental ethic out of the Buddhist ethical tradition. Indeed, the trouble of rocks and waters makes a Buddhist environmental ethic appear impossible. Buddhist ethics, like all of Buddhist philosophies, organized around the central concept of dukkha, stress, dissatisfaction, suffering, unease, and so forth. Beings experience dissatisfaction, stress, or suffering, and Buddhist thought and practice is directed towards identifying and addressing the source of this malaise. Dukkha is a phenomenological reality, which is necessarily experienced by individual sentient beings, and this makes the experiences of individual sentient beings the primary concern of the Buddhist ethic. If the intrinsic valuation of non-sentient phenomena like rocks and waters is a requirement of an environmental ethic, then directing Buddhist ethical formulations to this end would indeed be impossible at worst and a deviation from traditional norms at best. Similarly, the preservation of an abstract system like a holistic understanding of land or the maintenance of biodiversity for their own sake would be impossible to defend using traditional Buddhist ethical formulations, which center individual sentient beings. So by these metrics, it seems like Capper's contention that the prioritization of sentience in Buddhist moral theory amounts to a compassionate concern for animals that sponsors Buddhist actions for animal welfare, but substantially lacks the ecocentric elements required by a full environmental ethic. Thus, beyond Harris, Schmidthausen, and Elverskog's critiques of historical Buddhist orientations towards the natural world, it appears that any present or future environmental ethic based on Buddhist moral theory is philosophically untenable. However, in the midst of these critiques, I would nonetheless argue that it's methodologically inappropriate to evaluate a Buddhist environmental ethic by these standards. In the broader field of Buddhist ethics, scholars like J.L. Garfield, Barbara Clayton, and myself have begun pushing back against the common exercise of subsuming Buddhist ethics to a Western ethical categorization. This is due to how, as Garfield states, Buddhist moral theorists see ethics as concerned not primarily with actions, their consequences, obligations, sentiments, or human happiness, but rather with the nature of our experience. It is therefore does not fit neatly into a virtue ethic, consequentialism, or deontology, despite attempts of scholars like Keown, Goodman, and Berman to do so. And indeed, in our attempts to try to make it fit neatly into Western ethical theories, we not only distort some of the fundamental ethical assumptions of the tradition, but miss most of what makes it unique. If we begin from Buddhism itself and construct an ethical theory from its philosophical assumptions, then we arrive at a very different articulation of ethics in the form of a moral phenomenology, which brings with it novel avenues for ethical speculation and practice. Likewise, if we begin from Western environmental ethics and attempt to subsume Buddhist ethics to the standard, we not only run into philosophical incongruities, but miss out on a potentially novel articulation of environmental ethics. Thus, to avoid these two errors, we must begin from Buddhist philosophical principles and explore how the modern understanding of the environment looks through this particular philosophical lens. So to do so, the first major point to make is that any attempt to construct an ethic, be it environmental or not, based on intrinsic value is akin to building a house on a crumbling cliffside. It may stand for a while and it may provide some practical shelter from the literal storm of environmental catastrophe, but it will inevitably fall to the sea when subjected to philosophical analysis. In particular, it will fall when subjected to a Madhyamaka negative dialectical analysis. So in his Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, Nagarjuna shows how all phenomena are ultimately empty of intrinsic, independent existence. And he does so by means of refuting the four possible modes of causality. In its opening verse, he writes, "Not from itself, nor from other, nor from both, nor from no cause, does anything whatsoever, wherever, and whenever arise. Such a thing does not exist." So Nagarjuna shows how this emptiness of independent, intrinsic existence applies to both phenomena and the qualities of phenomena, including motion, the senses, agenthood, suffering, even nirvana, and in the end, all views. This, however, is not a nihilistic negation of the existence of all things, but a recognition of their radical relativity. Later in the text, Nagarjuna writes, that which is dependent origination, so that which is arising in interdependence or interconnection, is explained as emptiness. And that being a dependent designation is itself the middle way. So that's the Buddhist position. That's how to practice Buddhism. That being so, a thing which is not dependently arisen does not exist. Therefore, a thing that is not empty does not exist. So in other words, phenomena are empty of independent existence, but exist independence on a confluence of myriad causes and conditions, which they in turn are a cause and condition of. And this is the Madhyamaka understanding of pratitut samutpada, radical relativity and complete interdependence. Any notion of intrinsic valuation is therefore absurd. There's no independent thing which one can ascribe independent value to. For this reason, to construct an environmental ethic on the intrinsic valuation of natural phenomena is to make an error in the first order of the ontological status of phenomena. So this is not to say that value cannot exist, but it must be understood as a relative characteristic of relative phenomena. I would argue that not only is this relative value a sufficient baseline for environmental ethical speculation, but it's the only possible baseline for environmental ethics. In other words, not only is intrinsic value not a necessary prerequisite for an environmental ethic, as Nace, Rolston, and Capper may contend, but it is itself philosophically untenable when analyzed from this Madhyamaka Buddhist philosophical position. A Buddhist environmental ethic would therefore begin by ascribing relative value to the rocks, waters, trees, and the atmosphere, just as it would ascribe relative value to sentient beings. Second, the notion of preserving land, an ecosystem, or the global biosphere for their own sake would similarly be critiqued from a Buddhist philosophical position. This ascription of intrinsic value to a holistic picture of the biosphere would meet the same philosophical end as the intrinsic valuation of independent entities in the natural world. Of course, like individual rocks and waters, these holistic understandings of ecology would hold relative value for the well-being of individual sentient beings. And that this relative value may push back against classical formulations of the land ethic, but in fact, it approximates some of the sentiments of the earlier presentations of this instrumentalized sustainable biosphere, like Capper's contention that the full biosphere must be ecocentrically sustainable in terms of meeting the needs of both humans and non-humans today, while not sacrificing ecological needs of tomorrow. However, beyond this similarity, the Buddhist philosophical tradition would hesitate to prioritize the integrity of the whole at the expense of its parts, largely because of how the lack of the distinction between the two exists in the Buddhist tradition. In the Tibetan tradition, there's a particular term called no-chu, which literally translates to container and its contents. Typically, this is used as a metaphor for the universe and the sentient beings therein, kind of as pictured here. But it's also been used by contemporary Tibetan teachers to refer to an environment and its inhabitants, and to advocate for environmental consciousness in Buddhist communities. There's an important distinction, however, between the way this metaphor is employed in Tibetan contexts and the way that ecosystems, environments, or the biosphere are understood in popular environmentalist discourse. In ethical articulations of like the land ethic, the land and its inhabitants are obviously understood to be related to one another in a mereological sense, but they're nonetheless treated as distinct entities. The holistic land is one thing, the individual beings and phenomena that make it up are another, and the former is prioritized over the latter. This is not the case in the Buddhist understanding of no-chu. Just as Nagarjuna shows how cause and effect are mutually produced in this dialectical fashion, and therefore only exist in relation to one another, so too do the container and its contents only exist in relation to one another. In the absence of one, there's the absence of the other, since they're mutually produced. Thus, not only are the land, the ecosystem, or the biosphere relatively valued, like individual rocks and waters, but the distinction of a system apart from the individuals that make it up is necessarily rejected in favor of this dialectical understanding of the environment and its inhabitants. I would argue, however, that this rejection still leaves open the possibility of an environmental ethic that attends to the biosphere, while remaining squarely rooted in Buddhist moral theory. In the Mahayana tradition, the goal of religious practice is to liberate all sentient beings from all dukkha. Even if we understand this goal to be impossible, the Bodhisattva vow to liberate all sentient beings nonetheless compels an altruistic comportment and an ethical care towards the beings that one comes across in their day-to-day life. Even if sentient beings are taken as the sole arbiter of moral value, and we read Buddhist moral theory as more of an animal ethics than an environmental ethic, the philosophical maxims of the tradition necessitate that we attend to the myriad dependently originated causes and conditions that contribute to the flourishing or the alleviation of dukkha. These causes and conditions are, of course, involve environmental factors in both their individual and holistic sense, like rocks, waters, and atmosphere, the biosphere, ecosystem, and land. And when all of these factors are presented together, being the goal of liberating beings from dukkha, dukkha's arising in interdependence, and an understanding of the environment as a cause and condition of this dukkha, we can indeed arrive at an authentic Buddhist environmental ethic. This may contradict the ambivalence or the negative comportment towards the natural world that Schmidhausen identifies in early Buddhism, but we can easily explain why this is the case. Early Buddhism promoted the goal of the arahat, or individual liberation from dukkha, while the Mahayana tradition I'm operationalizing here promotes the goal of becoming a bodhisattva and liberating all sentient beings from all dukkha. To achieve the goal of early Buddhism, attending to the natural world is unnecessary and it may even be unhelpful. However, to actively work for the liberation of all sentient beings from the grips of dukkha, we must attend to the natural world, abiotic phenomena, and ecological formations at every scale. So in this approach to Buddhist environmental ethics, the trouble of rocks and waters subsides quite naturally. If there's no sentient beings left living, it doesn't matter what happens to the ozone, the oceans, or the ice caps. However, if there's a single sentient being left in samsara, in this realm of rebirth, one would still have to attend to the myriad non-sentient phenomena that would support this being in the matrix of dependent origination. So in this formulation, pratitya samutpada, or interdependence, and the philosophy of emptiness may radically relativize causality, but they certainly do not flatten all ethical value. This understanding of interdependence challenges both Harris and Capper's reading of pratitya samutpada as this flat ontology where all phenomena are of equal ontological status by virtue of their implication in pratitya samutpada and are therefore of equal moral worth. Interestingly, this issue of ethical flattening is commonly addressed in the fields of new materialism and object-oriented ontology, which wrestle with the implications of, to quote Timothy Morton, there being hardly any difference between a person and a pincushion. In these cases, however, this kind of ontology can in fact compel ecological thought and a tenderness to non-human others. And this is because of how human experience is still a factor, regardless of how we may theorize the ontological status of individual objects. Similarly, interdependence is not a theory divorced from human experience. And in the Buddhist context, it's inextricable from the reality of dukkha. Dependent origination points to the causal matrix and the radical relativity of all phenomena. But a discriminating awareness of what to adopt and what to reject in terms of their ethical efficacy and their contribution to the dukkha of sentient beings is maintained as a crucial point of Buddhist practice. Divorcing interdependence from its embedded context and ignoring the way that it is understood to compel compassionate action is inappropriate, and together they can indeed be used to construct a robust, authentic Buddhist environmental ethic. So with this in mind, the proper treatment of rocks, waters, air, soil, and other abiotic phenomena that make up our natural world can be seen as a precondition for alleviating the dukkha of sentient beings. If the ocean's too acidic, the soil composition inappropriate, or the air filled with too much carbon, then sentient beings will just amass greater amounts of dukkha, of stress, of suffering. Of course, biotic phenomena that fall outside the traditional Buddhist understanding of sentient being would fall under a similar treatment. So if we take interdependence, dukkha, and compassion seriously, then it becomes soteriologically or ethically necessary to ascribe relative value to these phenomena and treat them with care. This would be the case with broader holistic ecological concepts as well. A sustainable biosphere, a healthy bioregion, a flourishing land, and a preserved biodiversity are necessarily ascribed relative value in this Buddhist ethical context due to how their disruption greatly harms the individual sentient beings therein. If these environmental assemblages and their integrity were ignored, then harm would befall sentient beings, and one would not be working towards the alleviation of dukkha of all sentient beings. I'm not the first to suggest this necessity. John Clark, in a 2008 paper, makes this point clear in the Madhyamaka context when he writes, "For Nagarjuna, a being can only be understood adequately as a part of a system of relations. On the basis of such a philosophical position, there are good reasons to hold that our compassion for sentient beings must extend outward to the communities of life and the greater ecological wholes of which they are a part. Thus, while the intrinsic valuation of rocks and waters may be philosophically untenable, and the preservation of a sustainable biosphere for its own sake would be incommensurable with Buddhist philosophy, their relative valuation and a motivation to care for these necessary factors of an environmental ethic are nonetheless present in a Buddhist environmental ethic due to how they form the relative causes and conditions for the dukkha of sentient beings." Interestingly, if we search Tibetan Buddhist texts, we can see this concern for abiotic or non-sentient phenomena embedded in aspects of the core Buddhist tradition itself. For example, Gampopa's jewel ornament of liberation tells practitioners to first practice loving kindness and compassion, or meditatively cultivate loving kindness and compassion with sentient beings as their object, and then practice loving kindness and compassion with non-sentient phenomena as their object. So from an ethical or soteriological standpoint, there'd be no reason to practice loving kindness and compassion towards non-sentient phenomena if they were understood as discrete, independent entities, because they'd fall outside the purview of Buddhist ethical concerns. However, because they are relatively valued due to their implication in interdependence, Gampopa instructs practitioners to extend their practice of compassion to abiotic or non-sentient phenomena. Such a simple act as skipping a rock across a pond can fittingly ripple out to affect the well-being of the fish in the water and the critters who rely on the shoreline habitat. So it's imperative to give the rock, the water, and the act of throwing ethical consideration. In this way, Gampopa promotes ethical attention to non-sentient phenomena like rocks and waters as an extension of the more classical Buddhist concern for the well-being of all sentient beings. We can also see this connection explicitly made with natural phenomena throughout the Buddhist world, such as the Vinaya or the monastic regulations, admonitions against sprinkling water known to contain living beings on the ground, knowingly destroying seeds and plant life, and digging up dirt which may disturb beings in the soil. Similarly, we find a concern for the preservation of rocky mountains and glacial waters in Tibet due to how these local deities and these serpent beings are understood to rely upon these natural phenomena for their homes. Of course, this extension of relative value to the natural world was clearly insufficient to produce a mass historical environmental movement in traditional Buddhist settings, but we can nonetheless see how individual non-sentient phenomena like water and mountains were given ethical consideration as a consequence of the central Buddhist concern for alleviating the dukkha of sentient beings. Conversely, what was patently absent in the Buddhist tradition before the Buddhist encounter with modernity was a concern for broader ecological concepts, such as the species, the land, the ecosystem, and the biosphere. Then again, these concerns were also absent from every other religious, philosophical, and ethical tradition before modernity, because they're deeply informed by contemporary ecological sciences. Take, for example, the 9 boundaries that Rockstrom and colleagues have delimited as a safe operating space for humanity in their article of the same name. Each of these 9 boundaries, which include climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion, biogeochemical flow, biodiversity loss, and so forth, are a factor of a sustainable biosphere and must be tended to in any contemporary environmental ethic. But there's a reason that these aspects of a sustainable biosphere are present in recent works by Rolston and Capper, and not in some foundational works by Leopold, Mace, or J. Baird Callicott. And that's they were quantified in 2009. So these contemporary articulations of environmental ethics reflect this updated understanding of ecological science and incorporate their findings into their philosophy. Similarly, these notions of land, ecosystems, and biosphere can easily be assimilated into a contemporary Buddhist environmental ethic, despite them previously being absent. There's nothing to these notions that contradict with Buddhist philosophical principles, and they can in fact help the tradition better understand the causal matrix that it's so concerned with. These ecological concepts paint a clearer picture of the precise workings of interdependence, which allows Buddhists to more efficiently work towards the alleviation of the dukkha of sentient beings through environmental means. And this isn't an uncritical equation of pratitut samutpada with ecology, but a recognition of the many ecological processes that constitute the land in the biosphere and which are implicated in the matrix of dependent origination like any other phenomenon. They therefore must be attended to in these Buddhist ethical contexts. There is, however, one final critique that Capper makes about Buddhist environmental ethics, which is the problem of predation. One of the main strikes Capper makes against the Buddhist environmental ethic is that it cannot attend to the complexities of ecosystems with many preying individuals. To illustrate this point, he tells the story of Shabkar, pictured here, who, having watched an eagle prey on fledgling birds who tore out and devoured their hearts while they were still alive, uses a slingshot to deter the eagles from eating the birdlings and encourages others in the area to protect these young birds from the predatory eagles. Capper writes that this compassion is admirable and provides a nice window into Buddhist animal welfare sentiments, but nonetheless argues it lacks a systematic understanding of the natural world where eagles play important roles in ecosystem health. This is a fair point, but is easily explained away by the aforementioned discussion on the absence of the concept of scientific ecology and sustainability prior to modernity. That said, the problem of predation is one that an environmental ethic centered around sentient beings must acknowledge. Of course, this isn't a novel criticism, but it's a common problem that philosophers operating in both environmental and animal ethics have addressed in various ways. I'm not going to attempt to articulate a complete Buddhist response to this problem here, but instead we'll note how the vast majority of responses to this problem deal in absolutes. Jeff McMahon, for example, calls for the eradication of carnivorous species altogether, while Callacott conversely argues that we should never protect prey from predator. This contrasts with Clayton, Garfield, and my own analyses that Buddhist ethics should be read as non-absolutist. Whether we're dealing with Clayton's ethical particularism or a more systematic moral phenomenology found in the work of Garfield and myself, it's philosophically inappropriate to apply a universal rule to all situations from a Mahayana Buddhist perspective, which promotes the idea of upaya, or skillful means. Passages in both Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara and Shiksha Samuccaya make this clear. Respectively, they state, having understood emptiness in that way, a bodhisattva must continually exert themselves for the benefit of others. The bodhisattva who sees this emptiness extensively and possesses compassion is granted the ability to do even what is prohibited. And more provocatively, he writes, deliberately transforming into sex workers for the purpose of attracting the lustful, having drawn them with the hook of desire, the bodhisattva establishes them in the Buddha's primordial wisdom. Regarding even the most basic precept of killing living beings, the Upaya Kausalya Sutra preserves a narrative of the former Buddha Dipankara, who killed a murderous thief to prevent that thief from killing others and accruing negative karma. So this particularist approach to ethics amounts to what Carol Gilligan calls an ethic of care, or what Laurie Gruen has termed entangled empathy in non-human interactions. Following ecofeminist Marty Keel, they avoid the issue of trading in truncated narratives that, quote, wrench an ethical problem out of its embedded context. And they instead deal with the particular subjects, relationships, and variables of a given moral situation. With this in mind, the claim that Buddhism cannot attend to the complexities of an ecosystem with many preying individuals is simply not true. If Buddhist ethics were solely concerned with the preservation of sentient life and was incapable of deviating from a set of universal rules, then this might be the case. But that would be a blatant miscategorization of how Buddhist ethics operates philosophically and how it manifests in the lives of practitioners. The non-absolutist quality of its ethical system, which is expressed in this idea of upaya, or skillful means, and the ethic of care that emerges from Buddhist moral cultivation, primes Buddhists for doing spontaneously whatever the situation demands, based on the specific context in which a moral dilemma presents itself, and the relationships to other humans, non-humans, and broader ecological communities it involves. So perhaps Shabkar's scolding of the eagle and protection of the baby birds was appropriate in that particular ethical situation. Perhaps in other situations, it may be inappropriate to intervene in animal predation. In a more extreme case, there are situations where one could imagine the introduction of predator species to a new environment, or the active culling of invasive species may be justifiable through this Buddhist environmental ethical lens. To pass judgment on such situations in an abstract, universalist manner is to impose standards on the Buddhist ethical tradition that it may not recognize as valid. Thus, while the problem of predation may challenge a Buddhist environmental ethic, as it does Western environmental ethics, it certainly does not prevent an effective and authentic Buddhist environmental ethic from being articulated. In fact, the Buddhist tradition's particularist approach to ethical situations found in the writings on moral phenomenology may offer novel insights in the problems of predation, which has historically been approached through pretty much strictly absolutist terms. So I've used this term a couple times, moral phenomenology, and one might wonder, like, with all of this information, if we can construct this ethical theory from Buddhist kind of ethical principles, using dukkha, interdependence, and this idea that dukkha is ecologically produced, like, what would a Buddhist do to actually implement this? The paper I'm presenting right now, most of it at least, is going to be published in Environmental Ethics in the month or two. But this next part is kind of a deviation from that. So usually this next part isn't kind of included in this broader discussion of environmental ethics. This draws from some other work I'm doing on moral phenomenology and its implementation. But it's worth understanding, like, what would a Buddhist actually do with this information? So if we understand that an authentic Buddhist environmental ethic can be built from notions of dukkha, interdependence, and ecological science, how do we implement this understanding in our daily life? The answer to this can be found in Buddhism's ethical theory of moral phenomenology. My paper, Buddhist Ethics as Moral Phenomenology, in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics, presents quite a technical presentation of this theory. So for a more detailed explanation, you can look that up. But here I'll just go over some of the basics of this interpretation of Buddhist ethics. While a systematic articulation of ethical theory is absent in the Tibetan Buddhist philosophical tradition itself, contemporary scholars have interpreted Tibetan Buddhist ethics to be a kind of moral phenomenology concerned with the transformation of our experience of the world, and hence our overall comportment to it. So in other words, Buddhist moral phenomenology, it's an ethical theory centered on the experience of an individual, where perception and affect are the loci of moral development. And it rests on the assertion that action stems from an individual's immediate experience of the world, and that to change one's experience is to change one's behavior. Moral phenomenology is therefore an experiential and perceptual approach to ethics, which is built from notions that cognitive states, or our intentional modes, affective responses, or how we feel, and actions emerge from an individual's direct perceptual experience of the world. Ethical development in this theory therefore involves a reorientation of one's immediate experience of the world, rather than a reformation of one's actions. It entails a radical change of an individual's moral behavior by going directly to the root of experience, rather than refining one's ability to conduct a moral calculus or developing secondary qualities that themselves emerge from the grounds of experience. As such, a moral phenomenology primes an actor to respond spontaneously to situations as they present themselves in a manner which accords with their broader realization of their situatedness in myriad relationships, communities, ecosystems, and so forth. And key to this kind of ethical theory is what we might call, and what I've termed, a default perceptual mode. This is the lens through which we see the world, and involves both our bare sense experience, and more importantly, the way we label and process that sense data through our acquired conceptual frameworks. It's the way in which we experience the world as it happens, in the present, without reflection. And while it certainly involves concepts, these concepts and their associated affective or emotional states are instantly applied as indivisible from the sensory experience itself. Important to my employment of this term is how default perceptual modes are fluid, in that they're not biologically determined, but adapt to the conceptual concepts an individual develops within. So these default perceptual modes can also be influenced throughout one's life, and in dependence upon the conceptual frameworks one encounters, subscribes to, and intentionally cultivates. So beyond this kind of theory, there's also a framework that I argued can be used to implement this experiential approach to ethics. And a paper that's incredibly dry for those not interested will be coming out in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics in the next day or two. But for those that are interested, it's a good technical paper. But regardless, this framework can be used to work with default perceptual modes, to work with conceptual frameworks, and change our experience. So this framework is Ta Gom Chu Sum in Tibetan, which translates roughly to the three: view, meditation, action. This can be implemented a couple of different ways. but the most simple and the most common way that this is implemented as an ethical kind of framework is first one establishes an intellectual view. So that view could be interdependence in this case. You would first have to listen or encounter that view, maybe by reading or from your teacher or what have you. And then you would contemplate whether or not that view is correct. So you would kind of critique it in your mind, you'd like challenge it. You'd come to this kind of nuanced understanding of a particular philosophical view. Once you achieve this intellectual understanding, then you would move on to Gom, and you would actually meditate on it. You would meditate on this view until you have this direct meditative experience of the view, until that view gets incorporated to just be the way you see the world. So this would usually require lots and lots and lots of meditation in order to make that particular view, like interdependence, be your default perceptual mode, the way you see the world. And then like action in this formulation, would just come naturally. These first two steps are the major steps. The last is kind of the fruition in this case. A very kind of concise way of talking about view meditation action happens in Dilgo Khyentse's book, The Heart Treasure of the Enlightenment. He writes the first step in establishing the view is to acquire a proper understanding of the teachings about it. Then to incorporate the view into our inner experience, we put it into practice over and over again, and this is the meditation. Maintaining our experience of the view at all times and under all circumstances is the action. Through the constant combination of these three, view, meditation, action, the fruit of the practice of the Dharma will fully ripen. So what might this look like in this Buddhist ecological kind of context? Or in other words, what concepts would one plug into this framework to implement a Buddhist moral phenomenological environmental ethic? My answer would be precisely the concepts that we've seen thus far. The existence of dukkha, the causal matrix of interdependence, and the recognition that dukkha has environmental sources. So if one were to do this, one would go back to this framework and let's say they would come to this experiential realization of interdependence. That would be like the goal. So first they would have to establish an intellectual understanding about interdependence, what interdependence is. They'd have to come to this proper understanding of the teachings about it. Then one would meditate on interdependence again and again and again, put it into practice over and over. This would be the meditation. And then the goal would be to maintain the experience of the view at all times and under all circumstances. One would go about their day-to-day lives seeing the world as radically interdependent, which is typically not how we see the world. We typically see the world as independent phenomena interacting with one another. And this affects how we act within the world. So in this kind of formulation, this radical understanding or this radical experiential understanding of interdependence, the placement of interdependence as one's default perceptual mode would be the environmental ethic. A Buddhist ecofeminist scholar named Joanna Macy, like 25 years ago, wrote that a full recognition of the true nature of the self as interconnected with all life is essential because it can serve in view of ethics and morality. And she was really like intuiting this moral phenomenological approach, like way back when, though she didn't use that language at all. In this case, I would say that this recognition of the self as interconnected with all life wouldn't serve in view of ethics and morality, but would be ethics and morality. Like this would be the environmental ethic. That's broadly speaking what a Buddhist might do with this information. So to conclude, while many Buddhist scholars have criticized attempts to construct an environmental ethic from Buddhist sources, I argue that a Buddhist environmental ethic emerges quite naturally from the combination of the goal of liberating sentient beings from dukkha, the understanding of dukkha, of stress, suffering, and so forth, as dependently arising according to causes and conditions, and a novel recognition of the environment as a major causal factor of this dukkha. The central Mahayana Buddhist goal of liberating all beings from dukkha necessitates an attention to the causes and conditions of that dukkha, many of which are environmental in nature. This, in turn, compels the inclusion of non-sentient phenomena and broader ecological systems in Buddhist systems of ethical valuation, such that rocks, waters, air, and so forth are afforded relative ethical consideration, and a sustainable biosphere is recognized as a necessary ethical outcome. When each of these components of a Buddhist environmental ethic are internalized and are assumed as a part of one's default perceptual mode in this moral phenomenological sense, the Buddhist practitioner is primed to respond to ethical situations involving the more than human world skillfully and is able to naturally incorporate a concern for the environment in their normative Buddhist ethical comportment. The presentation of Buddhist environmental ethics that I forward thus pushes back against many of the early criticisms of such a philosophical project. While it recognizes how historical Buddhisms may have held a despotic view towards the natural world and had an active hand in its exploitation, it nonetheless argues that bringing the tradition into discussion with contemporary ecological thought is generative of an environmentally friendly attitude based on its traditional philosophical axioms. Further, while a Buddhist environmental ethic may appear impossible when evaluated through Western ethical standards of intrinsic valuation, I've shown how a Madhyamaka Buddhist analysis of phenomena renders independent or intrinsic valuation untenable. And I've argued that the relative valuation of non-sentient phenomena through an appeal to pratitya samutpada is sufficient for compelling environmentally friendly behavior that promotes a sustainable biosphere. When this emphasis on interdependence remains embedded in this ethical and soteriological context, and it maintains a firm connection to the compassionate wish to liberate all beings from dukkha, then the allegation that interdependence renders an ethical distinction between a rhino and an atom bomb moot is easily dismissed. Finally, I've shown that while the problem of predation may still exist in Buddhist ethical settings, it can nonetheless be mitigated through an appeal to its non-absolutist approach to ethical practice. It may be the case that this approach to environmental ethics that I've articulated will be regarded as shallow by the standards of deep ecology or other environmental philosophies, but from a Madhyamaka Buddhist perspective, such a shallow ecology is the only kind of ecology that's philosophically tenable. Thus, while the ethical considerability of rocks and waters may initially seem to trouble any attempt to construct a Buddhist environmental ethic, this talk has shown how an authentic Buddhist environmental ethic is certainly possible and indeed necessary in our present time of environmental catastrophe.